Before there were steam boilers, before there were diesel engines, before there were chainsaws or trucks or anything that ran on its own power, the lumber that built colonial America came out of mills that were run entirely by falling water. A river, a stream, a mill pond, a wooden wheel turning on a shaft as thick as a man's body, a set of wooden gears, and a saw blade that went up and down in a frame. That was the technology. It was simple in its parts and complicated in its details, and the men who ran these mills lived with a set of dangers that we now have a hard time recognizing because the machinery looks, in old photographs and in surviving examples, harmless. It was not harmless. It killed men in steady numbers for more than 200 years, and the way it killed them has been mostly forgotten because the killings happened one at a time, in small mills, scattered along thousands of miles of New England and mid-Atlantic rivers, and nobody was keeping count. The first water-powered sawmill in what is now the United States was probably built in the mid-1630s in what is now Berwick, Maine, on the Salmon Falls River. The records are not perfectly clear on exactly which mill came first, because several small operations were being set up in roughly the same years along the rivers of the New England coast, and the documentation from that period is fragmentary. What is clear is that by 1640 there were several sawmills in operation in New England, and by 1650 the number had grown to several dozen. These were small mills by later standards. A typical 17th century mill might saw a few thousand board feet of lumber a day, working with a single up and down saw blade driven by a water wheel that might be 12 or 15 feet in diameter. The lumber went to local construction, to ship timber, and increasingly by the late 17th century to export. The English colonies in the Caribbean needed lumber for sugar boxes and for construction, and the New England mills supplied it. The technology had come from England, and before that from medieval Europe. Water-powered sawmills had been operating in Europe since at least the 13th century. The basic design was well established by the time it reached the American colonies. A dam created a mill pond, water flowed through a sluice gate, called a penstock, and onto the wheel. The wheel turned a shaft. The shaft, through a set of wooden gears, drove a vertical sash that held the saw blade. As the sash moved up and down, the blade cut into the log, which was held on a wheeled carriage that advanced slowly toward the blade with each stroke. A skilled sawyer could keep the mill running for 10 or 12 hours a day in good water conditions, turning out plank after plank from logs that had been floated down the river or hauled in by ox team in the winter. The wheels themselves varied in design depending on the available water and the local topography. The most efficient was the overshot wheel, where the water came in at the top of the wheel and the weight of the falling water turned it. An overshot wheel could capture, in its best designs, around 65 to 70% of the energy in the falling water. Below that came the breast wheel, which received water somewhere on its upstream side, and was less efficient than overshot, but could work with less head of water. At the bottom was the undershot wheel, which sat in the current of the stream and was turned by the moving water against its lower paddles. The undershot was the least efficient, but it required almost no infrastructure beyond a small dam and a wheel mounted on a frame, and most of the smallest and earliest American mills were undershot. The size of the wheel was determined by the available head of water. In flat coastal areas, the wheels were smaller. In hilly or mountainous areas, where a stream could drop 10 or 20 feet over a short distance, the wheels could be much larger. The largest American mill wheels, built in the early and middle 19th century, reached diameters of 30 to 40 feet. The famous Burden water wheel at Troy, New York, built around 1851 for an ironworks rather than a sawmill, was 60 feet in diameter and is sometimes called the largest practical water wheel ever constructed. For sawmills specifically, wheels in the range of 20 to 30 feet were the upper end of common practice in the 19th century, with a few larger examples in specific locations. The saw itself, in the early period, was what is called a sash saw or muley saw. It was a long, straight blade, perhaps 6 or 7 feet long, mounted in a wooden frame. The frame ran in vertical guides and was driven by a connecting rod from a crank on the main shaft. Each turn of the shaft meant one full stroke of the saw up and down. A typical mill ran at perhaps 100 strokes a minute, which is to say the saw blade made about 2 strokes a second. The log moved forward on its carriage by a small amount with each stroke, advanced by a ratchet mechanism that engaged at the bottom of each downstroke. The cut was slow by modern standards. A 20-foot log of average diameter might take an hour or more to saw into planks. The same log, fed into a modern bandsaw or a large circular saw, would be cut in a few minutes. The sash saw was, however, the only practical mechanism available, and it remained in use in some American sawmills well into the 19th century, even after circular saws had become available. The circular saw came to America around 1814, when Robert Eastman is generally credited with installing one at a sawmill in Brunswick, Maine. The circular saw was much faster than the sash saw, but it had drawbacks. It required a much larger steel blade, which was expensive in the early 19th century when American steel production was still limited. It wasted more wood than the sash saw because its kerf, the thickness of the cut, was larger. And the early circular saws, before improvements in steel and in tooth design, tended to overheat and warp under continuous use. Through the 1820s and 1830s, the circular saw gradually replaced the sash saw in the larger and better capitalized American mills, but small rural mills continued to use sash saws for decades longer. The band saw, which is more efficient than either, did not become common in American sawmills until the late 19th century, by which point the water wheel itself was being replaced by steam. The men who worked these mills had specific job titles that reflected the work. The sawyer was the main operator. He controlled the gate that let water onto the wheel. He set the log on the carriage. He engaged the feed mechanism, and he stopped the saw at the end of each cut. The off-bearer took the sawn planks off the carriage and stacked them. The pondman managed the logs in the mill pond, getting them into position for hauling up the slip into the mill. There were typically apprentices or boys who handled the lighter tasks, including greasing the bearings, sweeping sawdust, and stacking edgings. A small mill might run with 4 or 5 men. A larger mill, especially one with multiple saws, might have 10 or 12. The work was steady when there was water and logs, and it stopped when either ran short. Most mills worked seasonally, with the heaviest sawing in the spring when the snow melt provided high water, and in the fall when the logs that had been floated down rivers during the spring drives were available. The dangers were several, and they came from several directions. The first and most obvious was the wheel itself. A turning water wheel in the open with no guards of any kind was a slow but utterly unforgiving piece of machinery. A man who slipped on the wet planking near the wheel, or who fell from a height while working on the wheel pit, could be carried under and drowned, or crushed against the wheel pit walls by the moving paddles. The wheels turned slowly, generally between 5 and 20 revolutions a minute, depending on size, but they had enormous mass and enormous torque, and they could not be stopped quickly. A man caught by a paddle had a few seconds to free himself before the next paddle came around. Most who were caught did not free themselves. The deaths from wheel accidents were typically reported in local papers as drownings because the body was usually recovered from the tail race, the channel below the wheel, where the water carried it after the wheel had passed over it. The gears were the second major hazard. The wooden gears that connected the main shaft to the saw drive were uncovered in nearly all early mills. They turned at a speed that varied with the gearing, but was generally fast enough to catch and pull in a loose sleeve, a coat, a beard, or a hand. A man who reached too close to a gear to adjust something, or who was working in the mill in winter with bulky clothing, could be grabbed by the gear and pulled into it before he had time to react. The injuries from gear accidents were severe. A hand caught in a gear would be crushed and torn off in the same motion. An arm caught in a gear would be amputated at the shoulder. A man whose clothing was caught in a gear could be pulled in entirely, and the result was a mangled body that the other workers would shut down the mill to extract, usually finding the man dead. The local newspapers of the 19th century carry hundreds of accounts of gear accidents in small mills. They are usually brief, perhaps 2 or 3 sentences, naming the man and the mill and the nature of the accident. The saw was the third hazard, and probably the most frequent source of less than fatal injuries. The sash saw moved up and down at perhaps 120 strokes a minute, and the blade was sharp and substantial. A sawyer who reached across the carriage to clear a knot or adjust the log could be cut by the descending blade. The cuts were usually to the hands or forearms. They were often serious. A blade that came down on a wrist could amputate the hand. A blade that came down on a forearm could open it to the bone. Without modern medical care, with no antiseptics until the late 19th century, with no antibiotics until the 20th, these wounds often turned septic and killed men who would survive them today. The combination of dirty water, rust on the blade, sawdust contamination of the wound, and the lack of clean dressings made mill injuries particularly dangerous. A man who lost 2 fingers in a sawmill in 1750 had perhaps a 50-50 chance of dying of infection within a month. Even a man who survived the infection was likely to lose more of the limb to the surgery, performed without anesthesia in the worst conditions imaginable. The log carriage was the 4th hazard. The carriage advanced the log toward the saw by means of a ratchet and a pole, and the log was held in place with iron dogs that bit into the wood. If a dog slipped, or if a knot in the log caused it to roll, the log could shift suddenly on the carriage. A sawyer who was standing in the wrong place could be struck by the moving log or pinned against the frame. The injuries from log accidents were usually crushing injuries: broken legs, crushed pelvises, broken backs. In the cramped quarters of a small mill, with the carriage tracks running close to the wall and the operator standing in a narrow space between the saw and the carriage, there was not much room to get out of the way of a misbehaving log. The water itself was a constant hazard in winter. The mill pond froze, the wheel froze if the mill was not running, and the wet surfaces around the wheel pit became coated in ice. Men slipped and fell into the water. Some were caught by the wheel. Others drowned in the mill pond after breaking through ice that they had assumed was thick enough to walk on. Winter was the season when much of the log hauling was done because the frozen ground made it possible to drag heavy logs from the woods to the river using ox teams. The logs were piled on the river ice or on the mill pond ice to be sawn when the spring water came up. A man working on the ice, surrounded by stacked logs that might shift and crush him. Working in sub-zero temperatures with hands that lost feeling in minutes, was at risk from several directions at once. Frostbite was endemic. Falls were common. The number of men who died from cold-related causes in the lumber industry of the colonial and early national period is hard to estimate, but it was not small. The 5th hazard, and the one that increased dramatically as mills grew larger in the early 19th century, was fire. A sawmill produced enormous quantities of sawdust and edgings. The sawdust accumulated in piles around the mill, often inside the building itself, and it was extremely flammable. A spark from a friction overheated bearing, an ember from the small stove that the workers used to keep warm in winter, a careless lantern could touch off a sawdust fire that would engulf the mill in minutes. The wooden construction of the mill itself, the wooden gears, the wooden carriage, the dry timber stacked on the loading dock, all of it burned readily. Men inside the mill when a fire started had to get out fast. Some did not. The accounts of mill fires in the 19th century include numerous cases of workers trapped inside, killed by smoke inhalation or by the collapse of the burning building. As mills began to use steam power in the mid-19th century, The fire hazard increased. The boiler itself was a source of fire. The wood and sawdust used to fuel the boiler were stored close to the firebox. The escape of flame from a poorly tended boiler could ignite the whole structure in seconds. The owners of these mills were a mix of farmers who ran a mill on the side, professional millers who operated mills as their main business, and increasingly through the 18th and 19th centuries, partnerships and small companies that owned multiple mills. A typical pattern in colonial New England was for a town to grant a mill site to a particular man, who would build the mill and operate it in exchange for grinding grain or sawing lumber for the local farmers at a set rate, usually a fixed share of the product. This was called a custom mill, and it served the local community rather than producing for distant markets. As markets developed and as the export trade grew, merchant mills became more common. These produced lumber for sale rather than for local use, and they ran on a more commercial basis. By the early 18th century, the merchant mills of Maine, New Hampshire, and Massachusetts were producing lumber for the West Indies trade in quantities of several million board feet a year. The mills were built along whatever streams could provide adequate power. In New England, this meant the Piscataqua and its tributaries, the Saco, the Merrimack, the Connecticut, and dozens of smaller rivers. In the mid-Atlantic, the Delaware and Susquehanna systems had hundreds of mills. As settlement moved west, the same pattern repeated. The Mohawk Valley in New York, the Allegheny system in Pennsylvania, the Cuyahoga and other Ohio streams, all of these were lined with sawmills as soon as settlers arrived. The mills tended to cluster at falls and rapids, where the head of water was greatest. Some river towns were built around the mills: Saco, Maine; Lowell, Massachusetts; Cohoes, New York. The names of these towns appear in business records and in technological history because their water power supported industries that grew up around the initial sawmills and grist mills. Saugus, Massachusetts deserves a particular mention because the Saugus Iron Works, built starting in 1646 on the Saugus River, included some of the most ambitious water power engineering of 17th century North America. The ironworks used multiple wheels to power blast furnace bellows, a forge hammer, and rolling and slitting machinery. The wheels there were not sawmill wheels, but the engineering knowledge that built them and the local labor force that maintained them spread out into the sawmill construction of the surrounding region. The Saugus operation is preserved today as the Saugus Iron Works National Historic Site, and several of its wheels have been reconstructed for visitors. The reconstruction gives a clear sense of what a 17th century industrial water wheel looked like, and the scale is impressive. The wheels at Saugus were not as large as the largest later American wheels, but they were larger than the typical small mill wheel of the period, and they ran heavy machinery. The construction of a mill was a substantial undertaking. The dam alone might take a season to build. It was typically a crib dam made of timber crib filled with rock, anchored to the bedrock of the riverbed where possible. The sluice gate, called the penstock, was a wooden structure that could be raised or lowered to control the flow of water to the wheel. The wheel pit, a stone or stone and wood chamber dug into the bank of the river, held the wheel and provided the channel for the water to flow out through the tail race. The mill building itself sat on top of the wheel pit or beside it, usually a two-story wooden structure. The first floor held the saw and the carriage. The second floor, if there was one, was used for storage or for additional machinery. The whole construction, dam to finished mill, might take a year of work by a small crew, and it required the skills of a millwright who was a specialized carpenter with knowledge of water power engineering. Good millwrights were in demand throughout the colonial period and into the 19th century, and they typically traveled from job to job, building or rebuilding mills on contract. The wooden gears were a particular feature of these mills. The teeth of the gears were made of hardwood, typically hickory or maple, and they were set into the rim of a wheel that was itself made of softer wood. The teeth could be removed and replaced when they wore out, which was a major maintenance operation. A mill that was running steadily might need to replace gear teeth every few months. The teeth wore quickly because they bore against each other under heavy load, and the wear was uneven, with the bearing surfaces flattening and cupping over time. A skilled millwright could keep the gears running for years with regular maintenance, but the work required precision. A gear with worn teeth would run rough, would shake the whole mill, and would eventually break, with consequences that could include serious damage to the rest of the machinery and serious risk to the operators. The shaft on which the wheel turned was usually a single piece of timber, typically oak, perhaps 2 feet in diameter and 20 or more feet long. It rotated on bearings made of metal lined with wood or with a softer metal such as brass. The bearings required constant lubrication, usually with animal fat or with whale oil, and the bearing surfaces wore down and had to be replaced periodically. A bearing that failed could allow the shaft to drop out of alignment, which could throw the whole mill out of operation until repairs were made. In the worst cases, a bearing failure could cause the shaft to bind or to break, and a broken shaft on a turning wheel was a serious accident with timber fragments potentially thrown in any direction. The records of individual mill accidents in colonial and early national America are scattered, but they are not absent. Local newspapers from the 18th century onward carry routine accounts of mill deaths. A search through the Boston papers of the 1750s and 1760s turns up dozens of fatal mill accidents in New England in those decades alone. The accounts are brief. A man named Samuel Goodwin of Berwick, Maine, was killed in 1755 when he was caught in the gears of a sawmill on the Salmon Falls River. A boy named John Davis of Newburyport, Massachusetts, drowned in 1761 when he fell from the wheel platform of a sawmill on the Merrimack and was carried under the wheel. A man named Ezra Putnam of Andover was crushed in 1779 when a log shifted on the carriage at the mill where he worked. The names go on. Each case is its own story, briefly told, and the total number of these deaths over the 2 centuries during which water-powered sawmills were a common American industry is certainly in the thousands. The mills also injured and killed children. It was common for boys of 10 or 12 to work in mills, sweeping sawdust, greasing bearings, fetching tools, and doing other light tasks. They were small enough to move easily through the machinery, and they were paid less than men. They were also more vulnerable to accidents. A boy reaching around a moving shaft to oil a bearing could be caught by his sleeve and pulled in. A boy walking across the wet planks near the wheel could slip and fall. The child labor records of the 19th century document the injuries and deaths of children in sawmills in considerable numbers, especially after the rise of larger commercial mills in the 1840s and 1850s. Reform movements eventually targeted this practice, but it persisted in rural areas into the 20th century. The transition from water power to steam power began seriously in American sawmilling in the 1840s. Steam engines had been available for industrial use since the early 19th century, but the early steam engines were expensive, fuel-hungry, and unreliable. As engine design improved and as the price of engines fell, steam became economically competitive with water power for sawmilling. The advantages of steam were several. A steam-powered mill did not depend on the seasonal flow of a river. It could be located anywhere, not just at falls and rapids. It could run 24 hours a day if necessary, without regard to dry seasons or frozen rivers, and it could drive multiple saws at higher speeds than most water wheels could practically achieve. By 1850, steam-powered sawmills were common in the larger lumber-producing regions, and by 1880 they had largely displaced water mills in commercial sawmilling, although small custom mills continued to use water power in rural areas for decades longer. The last commercial water-powered sawmills in the United States operated into the early 20th century. A handful are still operating today as historic sites and demonstrations rather than as commercial producers. The Ledyard Uptown Sawmill in Connecticut, originally built in 1860 and restored to operating condition, runs on certain days for visitors and produces a small amount of lumber. The sawmill at Old Sturbridge Village in Massachusetts is a reconstruction that demonstrates the operation of a typical New England sash sawmill of the 1830s. The mill at Hopewell Furnace National Historic Site in Pennsylvania is preserved as part of an iron-making operation that depended on water power throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Several smaller historic mills in New England and the Mid-Atlantic operate occasionally. The collection at the Plymouth Patuxent Museums in Massachusetts includes water power demonstrations that illustrate the technology of the 17th century. The men who worked these mills are mostly invisible to history. They were small farmers, town residents, traveling craftsmen, and laborers. They did not generally leave written records. The accounts we have of mill work in colonial and early national America come from a few sources. The records of mill owners who kept business accounts and sometimes diaries. The records of millwrights, a few of whom wrote technical treatises that survive. The local newspapers that reported accidents and other events, and the records of estate inventories and court proceedings, which sometimes mention mill equipment in detail. From these sources, it is possible to construct a general picture of the work, but the individual experiences of the workers themselves come down to us only in fragments: a name, a town, a manner of death. Occasionally, a court testimony in a wrongful death case or an industrial dispute. Occasionally, a letter or a diary entry. Most of what these men knew about their work, about the daily routines of running a sawmill, about the small adjustments and tricks and dangers that they learned from years of doing the work, has been lost. The mills themselves, the buildings and the wheels and the dams, have also mostly disappeared. A sawmill was not built to last forever. The wooden structures rotted in the wet conditions of mill operation. The dams were swept away in floods. The wheels were replaced as they wore out, and when the mill was finally abandoned, the wheel was usually salvaged for whatever timber and metal it contained. The stone foundations of old mills can still be found along many New England streams, half buried in the woods, with the remains of dams and mill ponds nearby. Industrial archaeologists have catalogued many of these sites, and the New England landscape contains thousands of them, some recognized and protected, most simply visible to anyone who walks the streams with an eye for the regular geometries that indicate a former human construction. The lumber that came out of these mills built the colonial cities of the eastern seaboard. The wooden houses of Boston and Salem and Newport and New York, the wharves and warehouses of the colonial ports, the ships that carried American goods across the Atlantic, the barrels and crates and shipping containers of the colonial trade, all of this depended on the slow output of thousands of small water-powered mills. The volume was not enormous by later standards. A good 17th century mill might produce a few 100,000 board feet of lumber a year. By the standards of the great industrial sawmills of the late 19th century, which could produce tens of millions of board feet in a single year, the colonial mills were small operations, but there were many of them, and over time their cumulative output was substantial, and it transformed both the built environment of the colonies and the forests of New England, which were significantly cut over by the end of the 18th century. The deforestation of New England in the colonial and early national period is a part of the story that often gets overlooked when people think of the destruction of American forests. The big timber rushes of the 19th century in the Great Lakes region and the Pacific Northwest and the Redwood Country get most of the attention. But the original New England forest, the old growth that the first colonists encountered, was largely gone by 1800. The combination of clearing for agriculture and cutting for lumber, ship timber, and firewood reduced the forest cover of southern New England from near complete to perhaps a third of the land area by the early 19th century. The forests have since regrown to a significant degree as agricultural land was abandoned in the late 19th and 20th centuries, but the original old growth is essentially gone. A few small remnants exist in places that were too steep or too remote for early cutting. Most of New England today is forested with second or third growth. The men who fed the water-powered sawmills were participants in the first sustained industrial production in North America. The sawmills predate the ironworks, predate the textile mills, predate the railroads. They were the earliest large-scale application of mechanical power to manufacturing in what became the United States. The technology was not new. It had existed in Europe for centuries, but its application on a scale appropriate to the forest resource of North America was new. The mills that lined the rivers of the colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries were the beginning of American industry. They built the country physically, in the form of houses and ships and infrastructure, and they laid the groundwork for the larger industrial transformations that followed. The men who ran them, and the men and boys who were killed and maimed in them, are mostly nameless now. But their work is the foundation on which everything else was built. The wheels are mostly gone. The mills are mostly gone. The work is gone. The deaths are largely uncounted, and the names of the men who did the work are mostly lost. What remains is the lumber, in old houses and barns and churches that are still standing across New England and the Mid-Atlantic, cut from trees that no longer exist by men who no longer have names, in mills powered by water that still flows but no longer turns wheels. Walk through any old town in Maine or New Hampshire or Vermont, look at the timbers in the older buildings, and you are looking at the product of a kind of work and a kind of dying that has been almost entirely forgotten by the country that depended on it for 200 years. That is what those wheels were, and that is what they cost.